Okay, assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back to TAP Thought Adventure Podcast. Today we have a very special episode for you guys today with a guest. Some of you may be familiar with. His name's Michael Jones. How you doing, Mike?
Good. How you doing? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. We're happy to have you. So, if you don't know him by Michael Jones, he also goes by Inspiring Philosophy. He's got his own YouTube channel. And I mean, I'll let you explain more who you are. I don't want to speak for you. But today, just to be clear, guys, we are here, as you can see, of the title of the stream is to have a discussion on the Trinity. Abdul Rahman, by the way, is here as well. He will be contributing lightly to the conversation and, just kind of moderating anything if need be. But he's a bit hung up at the moment. But so the discussion is going to be on the Trinity. I spoke to Michael before we went live. We're going to be trying to explore a bit of his understanding of what the Trinity is and maybe raise any potential concerns with it if need be. But before we get into that, Michael, is there anything you want to say to the audience as far as more introduction of who you are or what your interests are or anything like that?
I just introduced myself. I'm Michael Jones. I run Inspiring Philosophy, do YouTube videos. I'm doing a bunch of TikTok videos now. I just got my master's in philosophy from the University of Arizona. And that's basically it. I make a lot of different graphic-driven type videos defending theism, Christianity, those kind of things.
Mm-hmm. So what was just out of curiosity, what was your master's on?
Philosophy. I didn't really specialize in anything. I was going to specialize in philosophy of science, but then the professor I wanted to study under retired. So I focused a little bit on ethics, a little bit on philosophy of mind, just try to get my feet wet, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm. Did you have to write a thesis or anything like that or no?
No, I didn't have to. They didn't require it, and I didn't really think it was necessary for what I was doing.
Okay. All right, cool. All right, so we might as well just launch right into this. I was discussing briefly with Michael before we went live. There's a well-known problem in the Christian literature that has to do with the Trinity, which, as far as my research goes, and as far as I can tell, goes back all the way really to the 4th century. Obviously not expressed in exactly the same way as modern Christian analytics explain it, but it's something known as the logical problem of the Trinity. For my audience, people have seen me speak about it many times, but I'll just briefly explain what the potential problem is, and then we'll hear Michael's thoughts on the argument or the concern. And then, that'll provide us a way, I think, into trying to understand better what he understands the Trinity to be, because I think maybe he'll agree with me that even if you agree as a Christian that the Trinity is true, there are different ways of understanding it or sort of fleshing it out. So we're going to try to see what we can do with Michael here today to better understand where he's coming from and maybe his grasp and understanding of the Trinity. So anyway, the logical problem of the Trinity, and you guys can find it if anybody wants to look into it more in this book, Philosophical and Theological Essays on the Trinity. It's literally mentioned in the introduction on the first page. I'm not going to read directly out of that, but if people want to look into it a bit more. However, the basic point is this. And the concern can be formulated either in 3 premises or 7 premises. It depends. That Christians make the claim that the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, and the Father is not the Son, the Father is not the Holy Spirit, and the Son is not the Holy Spirit, and there is only one God. And the concern primarily is a concern over polytheism, because the idea is that, well, if the Father is God and the Son is God and the Holy Spirit's God, and they're not each other, then it seems like you would have, on a straightforward basis, 3 gods. But yet we're told that there's only one God. So that's really the potential concern. Now, there have been attempts, and this book actually goes through it in quite a bit of detail from different Christian scholars trying to respond to this supposed problem. And one of the key things I think in the argument itself, or the concern, is a question over an interpretation of the word is, which may seem pretty pedantic to some people, but I think I think it does make a significant difference. That when we say the Father is God, what does that actually mean? Does it mean that the Father is identical to God, in the same way that Jake, for example, is identical to the Muslim metaphysician, that they're just two names that refer to the same thing? Or is God or divinity being used as a predication of the subject, which is the Father? And these are two different ways of understanding it. And based on that, you'll see different Christians interpret it differently and explain their models differently. And some can be radically different from one another. So anyway, I'm just going over this to kind of give a basis to the discussion itself. This is one of my potential concerns with the discussion, or with the Trinity itself, one of the issues that I have. Now, to be fair, the Christian authors in this text and other places, they will take a position on this question of the is of identity and is of predication, and they will flesh out their model in much more detail in an attempt to explain why, at the very least, the doctrine of the Trinity is not contradictory, or doesn't contradict some fundamental classical law of logic or things of that. Even if they can't fully explain it, they try to give a general picture of it in answering this problem, to show at the very least it's not contradictory. There's nothing in and of itself that is illogical, even if we can't fully understand it, or if we don't have all the metaphysical details of the doctrine. So anyway, Michael, I just want to turn it over to you now and ask you, what are your thoughts on this supposed logical problem, and how would you attempt to address it?
So I think it's an interesting issue, nonetheless. Just to be clear on the outset, I don't hold to an Aquinian view. I would hold to something very similar to Dr. Sijuwati. So I'm a social Trinitarian, and I hold to the monarchical view. So I just want to clarify that out in the onset, so we know where we're coming from. One of the things, though, I think that has been deficient in the theology developing the Trinity is the study of philosophy of mind. And that's what I hope to try to help bring to the table a little bit here. I don't think, I remember I attended a lecture from J.P. Moreland in 2019 where he was talking about how theologians have just not been consulting philosophers like they should be, and that's resulting in some deficiencies in their theology. And I couldn't help but agree. He didn't mention the Trinity at all, but I feel like that's an area where it can help, because God is a mind. God is not a physical being. So when we see William Lane Craig comparing the Trinity to a cat and its skeleton, or comparing the Trinity to a light source or to a three-leaf clover, it seems like there creates logical issues, because we're comparing a mind to physical things. That, to me, is a problem. We need to start applying philosophy of mind. And if you study philosophy of mind, you understand that the physical world and the mental world are separate. They're distinct. There's different parameters for each. For example, I will not say I have thoughts on top of my memories or behind my desires. And not say that 30% of my mind is my personality, 30% is my desires, maybe another 30% dispositions. You get the idea. We don't talk about philosophy of mind, the mental world, and those same kind of parameters. So I think what we need to be clear on the outset is, if my challenge would be this. I understand that the Trinity needs to be explained. That's Christians to be able to do this. But if you want to show the Trinity is illogical, it needs to be done within the parameters of philosophy of mind. And I will argue that's much harder to do once we start getting into these issues here about what we mean by agent, what we mean by disposition, mental properties in general. And that's what I kind of want to flesh out. So on the outside, I just want to ask you a couple questions, just so we're on the same page. These are not trick questions at all. So what is your view of philosophy of mind? Are you a physicalist, substance dualist, idealist? Where would you fall in there?
No. I'm not a physicalist. Yeah, so I would agree that the mind and the brain are not of the same substance. I would be a substance dualist.
Okay, so that's close enough. I'm an idealist. I would say all is mind, so a little different. but not really important. How would you define an agent?
So an agent to me is, I think, it is a difficult question to answer.
It is a difficult. These are not trick
Now,
questions.
yeah,
These are
no. So
difficult
I would
questions.
say an agent is a subject with the ability to act, the sort of being that can have thoughts, emotions, have a will, etc.
That's great. So this is an issue of debate in philosophy of agency, philosophy of free will, philosophy of mind in general. So let me just rant here for a little bit to try to get some of this stuff out. So, like, for example, you define an agent very similar to like Harry Frankfurt would define an agent. An agent, which is what did I write down here? They have certain desires within the mind and decide which ones to act upon. So it's like I'm this little agent inside my mind. I can decide between different desires, different thoughts. One of my professors this year, Michael McKenna, said, if you're thinking about one view of agency, there are these things called real self views. And that basically is that some elements of the agent's inner life as genuine parts of the agent, other elements then are treated as external or alien to the person, so that these elements are like actual chains or doors that the agent can act upon. So philosophers talk about agents sort of like in the sense like maybe there's like this analogous, like a little man in the machine deciding between certain things. There's a problem with that, as philosophers will, acknowledge. So it can be brought up by an analogy that was put out by Nami Arpale and Timothy Schroeder. They said, picture this guy called Travis, and he's on his way to a very important meeting with a client. He comes to a crucial intersection. At the intersection, he turns left, but he needed to go straight to get to the meeting. The reason why he turned left at the intersection was because that's his typical routine that he drives to work every day, and he just did it out of habit. So then we need to ask, is he morally responsible for being late to the meeting? He cannot show up and say, no, sorry guys, the other parts of my mind got control and I went and turned left. It's not my fault. Well, no, that doesn't make sense. Clearly he would be morally responsible for his own actions. As Alfred Mehle said, desires don't float free from beings. They're part of who we are. But that creates kind of a conundrum here. Now, I know I'm not gotten to the Trinity yet. I'm just trying to build up some foundation here. But so back to the idea of agency. Sometimes it seems like there's two senses of agency in our own being. We have what I would call a narrow sense of agency. This is what McKenna was talking about, this conscious will that decides between different things, and a broad sense of agency, the collection of our desires, emotions, our thoughts, our dreams, our goals, personalities, dispositions. And sometimes it seems like we are an agent within an agent. We say things like, I'm too hard on myself, or I can't control myself when X, Y, or Z happens. Or, you could think of the alcoholic, for example, who is, they cannot control themselves from drinking, even though they may have a desire to not be that kind of person. So it seems like, for example, Daniel Dennett says, philosopher of mind, he says, I have created and unleashed an agent who is myself. If it acts, produces harm. The manufacturer is held responsible. So going back to the analogy, that's why we can say Travis is responsible. He created a broad sense of agency that had habits that made him turn left. So essentially, now I'll just right out and say it, my view of the Trinity would be this understanding of agency. There is one God who is three narrow senses of agency in a broad sense of agency, one being. So the persons are the narrow senses of agency, and the being of God is the fullness of the Trinity in that kind of sense. So that's generally what I'm thinking of. Now, my basic argument will be is that when we get into the nitty gritty of this, it's a lot harder to argue about this because we're going to start applying parameters from philosophy of mind in that sense. If we can understand ourselves in that, we tend to see ourselves sometimes as one person, one being, but sometimes we have different aspects of our agency, two different senses of agency. There can be a logical connection there that we can make with regards to the Trinity. So applying philosophy of mind to theology is going to be might help explain these kinds of things.
Yeah. Were you finished, Michael, or can I?
Yeah, I don't want to go on too long.
Okay.
If you want to throw out anything, I'll come back to it. I got some other analogies I want to use, but we'll get there.
Yeah. So I think something that may be helpful is to understand what you're not saying. And maybe that will help us understand what you are saying. Because in the beginning, you said that you don't have a Thomistic understanding of the Trinity, but some people may not know what that is. So what would the key relevant difference be with the Thomistic understanding and what you're basically saying? I think it's going to center around how you understand persons. Would you say that that's fair?
Yeah, I'm not taking a Latin view of the Trinity. I'm taking more of a Eastern view, the social Trinitarian model, the idea there are three wills
Mm-hmm.
in God.
Mm-hmm. And what, I guess my question would be, why would you take that view? Why do you favor this view, and why do you not think that that view is sufficient for capturing the Trinity? Or I don't know, however you want to phrase it. Why do you favor your view instead of the other one?
Two views, the most important one. I think this is what Scripture teaches when it talks to the persons of the Trinity, and also I think I worry some Latin models could drift towards modalism. Now they'll accuse the social view of drifting towards tritheism. That's a debate there to have. But I also think in philosophy of mind, you can make a coherent model using this.
Okay, so that's fair. So the way that you've explained it, because I'm just trying to picture it in my head. I mean, obviously we haven't gotten too far yet, but
this is all new, and this is stuff I'm just testing the water with. It's something I'm slowly developing myself too.
Yes, yeah, that, which is great, because I think this will be new for your viewers as well as ours, and to trying to understand these things better. Now, just the way that you explained it, when I picture it in my head, it seems similar to William Lane Craig's understanding of it. Now, I know you didn't like the analogy of the cat and skeleton. I get that, and the three-headed dog or whatever else, but just in a visual sense, I don't know. Have you read on his model of the Trinity, and would you say that it is a fair comparison in some sense?
No, I think it drifts towards partialism.
Okay.
I don't think he's applying enough philosophy of mind. I think if he did, it would help it in a lot of ways.
Okay, because it seems to me like the way that you were describing it is if you have this one agent or sort of larger consciousness, and then within it you have these subconsciousness. Not subconsciousness is not the right word, but you have these I don't know, these alternative expressions of the consciousness itself.
No, not really. So that's a little bit of, I probably needed to explain more. So when we're talking about our own agency, we tend to think of ourselves as like this mental agent inside of a much broader sense of our own being. And I'm saying that there would be three consciousness, not that they are sort of like subconsciousness parts. There were three consciousnesses within the being itself. If you want another analogy, I could get to that, but I maybe that help explain.
I guess what would if you want to give an analogy, but I guess what I'm trying to wonder is, in what sense is there not a sort of part whole relationship? Because it seems like we have the one thing, which is the big circle, and then we have like three smaller circles within it. So what am I guess visualizing correctly?
I was anticipating the partialism objection. The problem with partialism is that it assumes, again, physical parameters. We don't talk about aspects of our mind as like 30% thoughts, 30% memory, these kinds of things. When I talk about my own agency, I can say I'm a narrow sense inside of a broader sense, but I'm still fully an agent. I don't think I'm just half limited, half or narrow, half broad. I'm fully percent, or I'm 100% both in that sense. I'm 100% my own narrow sense of agency, 100% my broad sense of agency. Even though at times I can distinguish different aspects of my mind that I can separate myself from, but I don't think they now become a separate whole thing. They're still part of who I am in that mental sense, not in terms of like a physical part that separates itself. So my whole issue would be is that when we speak of the Trinity, we could say the Father, Son, and Spirit are fully the broad sense of agency. They have all of the same essence. They share all the same thoughts, desires, wholeness in that sense, even though there are three distinct centers of consciousness within the triune nature of God.
Okay, but you would agree. So, I mean, going back to the LPT itself, you would be using the is as a predication, not identity, correct?
Yeah, I'm a
Because
monarchical Trinitarian. Yeah.
yeah, so the like the Father in this sense is not identical to God. Neither is the Son nor the Holy Spirit. It's being predicated of the subject. Now they're also not parts of God insofar as the way that you're understanding it. Would you say that the Father, Son, and Spirit, each one of them is fully God? So you wouldn't say they're part of God, right?
Correct. They are fully
Okay.
God, just like my limited sense. Like I would say, I'm fully my broad sense of agency, even though I'm fully my limited sense of agency.
Okay. Right. Okay. And then, so yeah, then the potential concern is going to be how we avoid tritheism there, and I guess that's something you want to talk about more with
Right.
your analogy, right? So
So,
if you want to present another one, go ahead.
so again, if we're going to talk about God, we got to talk about him as he's a mind. We got to compare him to a mental analogy. He cannot be compared to like a physical thing because that'll result in all sorts of like issues. There was a recent show that came out. It was a Marvel show called Moon Knight. Did you see it?
No, I have not seen it actually.
So let me
Sorry.
explain the show. The main character is set up as someone who has multiple personality disorder or DID. He really doesn't, because someone with DID, dissociative identity disorder, is like one conscious agent and they rotate between different alters. You never see like two alters like talking to one another. In the show, though, he is three conscious agents that coexist. They talk to one another. They can exist in the same mind. Yet they're all fully have the power of Moon Knight. They all can take control. They all become Moon Knight. They share desires, they share emotions, they share goals, dispositions. But there's three distinct centers of consciousness in this one being. So it kind of provides an analogy on how to look at triune God. If you take this analogy and you give it to a being that has omnipotence, omniscience, moral perfection, who is not caused or is outside of time and eternal, it gets much closer to the idea of the Trinity. You have three consciousness that coexist inside one being. Even though that they are distinct from one another, they all are fully Moon Knight in some sense. They all can fully grasp the nature of Moon Knight. They all can fully they all share memories. They share thoughts with each other. They share desires. So they all share the same broad sense of agency, even though they are three limited or narrow senses of agency within this one being. So in that same sense, you could think of, if you watch the show, unfortunately you haven't, this one being who can be three centers of consciousness, even though they all share the same broad sense of agency.
Okay. I just want to say welcome to Abdul Rahman. So, okay, let me see, because again, I'm just trying to understand the position well.
Yeah, and it's going to be complicated because we've not gotten really deep into philosophy of mind yet.
Yeah. So one question I have, because you were saying they share in some sense thoughts, emotions, etc. But is there anything distinct about their mental states? Meaning, do they have distinct mental states and thoughts from one another?
In the show, so again, this is an analogy. I wouldn't say it perfectly compares to the Trinity by
Yeah.
definition of an analogy, but yeah, there is at some point they're able to keep limited information from one another. Now, I would say that in the Trinity, no, it's not the same thing because they all share the same essence and therefore they're all omniscient. But in that show, yes, they are able to. However, they all share the same power.
Hmm. Okay. Because I guess what I'm thinking about is, for example, when um, the Father says that I am the Father, or the Son says I am the Son, or the Holy Spirit says I am the Holy Spirit, um, you wouldn't say that they're sharing in the same way those thoughts, right? Because then that would seem to present a problem as far as modalism goes. So it seems
Correct.
like they have to have some type of thoughts that are distinct from one another.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Um, okay. So I guess maybe you can proceed further with what you think is going to best explain further what you're saying when it comes to philosophy of mind or its application here.
Yeah. I mean, so again, when we talk about philosophy of mind, think of the problems of like Craig trying to compare the Trinity to a cat and its skeleton. These become different parts, or Cerberus, the three-headed dog. They become different parts, and it just collapses to partialism. But when we talk about what's happening within our own minds, it's really hard to divide things into parts. Like you could say a desire is a part of you, but where does that stop? Like if you have a desire to be a Muslim, you're not going to say, well, that fully flows through you. You're going to accept that's fully flowing through you. You would not think, well, it's just one part of me. You would say that's part of your full being. We could say that, your free will is a very important ability that you have. It's not just something you can turn on and off. I don't know if you believe in free will. I'm just using that as an analogy. So different different memories, different dispositions we have. They're fully part of our being, even though we can think of them as parts in a metaphor. When we start talking about mental substances, it's very hard to think of them as parts when you start to really get down to what they actually are. This is the issue when it comes to philosophy of mind. We don't fully even understand our own agency entirely. This is why there's different models of agency. There's like real self views, there's mesh views. Where is the line between our own sense of agency in terms of a broad sense and a narrow sense? So if I could say, well, I wouldn't say I'm two different agents inside my mind. I'm one agent, even though I can think of my agency acting in different ways. For example, if I'm watching a movie, I could be experiencing desire of happiness or shock. I would say my full agency is experiencing that. However, if I'm going to decide between which PhD program to go into, I might weigh different desires. I might explore my narrow sense of agency and say, well, I like this one program has some pretty good things I like. This other program has other things I different like. So the reason why I'm bringing all this up is because I'm thinking of Brian Lefto's objection about there being two different divinities in the social Trinitarian model. And my whole point is that when you start thinking about a mental substance, when you start thinking about a limited or a narrow sense of agency in their broad sense, we don't think of ourselves as if we're two different humans. We have two different natures in that sense. We still think we're one human. We just have a very narrow sense of agency that can be explored inside of a broad sense. So it doesn't really need to be two different types of divinities there. We can have, and the triune God can be three centers of consciousness. They all share in the same broad sense of agency. And there's not going to be two distinct categories of divinity there, because that would be assuming there's some sort of physical separation. The mental world is a lot more blurry when it comes to things like that. We can see it through we can see it through comparing it to our own understanding of agency.
Right. Yeah. Obviously, we wouldn't say that they're physical parts, but then you're bringing up the issue. Well, how do you even divide supposed mental parts? I understand what you're saying, but assuredly, my thought right now about this discussion is not the same about my thought of what I ate for dinner last night, right? Mm-hmm. So there is some type of real distinction between mental thoughts. So are you just saying that you don't believe that there are immaterial parts or mental parts whatsoever? You think that that's just a meaningless phrase?
My question is, how would we divide it? How would we talk about it? Like, what do we mean by parts? So my question is,
in the sense that they're not identical. Like,
okay.
Yeah. So
yeah,
my
thought is, I would say they're not identical, but again, the line is still going to be very blurry. I can have a thought of a memory. I can have a thought of a desire. I can desire to remember something. I can desire to think of something. There's a lot of blurriness. Like you gave the example of different thoughts you had from today versus now. I mean, yeah, there's going to be distinctions there, but where do we actually? It's very hard to draw a fine line in terms of the distinction.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, to me, when I think about my own mental life, I can see, and I'm obviously this is not the same with God. If he's omniscient, then he has presumably access to all elements of his own consciousness. So it's going to be difficult to say, because I certainly don't have access to some of my previous thoughts that I had, even maybe last week, right?
Right.
Where God obviously would. But what I'm saying here is, in the case of the Trinity, there are certain thoughts that the persons of the Trinity would not be able to share, in the sense that they are what are called indexicals. Like when I use the word I, and Michael uses the word I, or Rahman uses the word I, even if we form the exact same proposition or sentence with it, when I say that I am hungry, or you, Michael, say that I am hungry, meaning yourself, obviously they're not expressing the exact same thing, because the word I there is functioning differently. It has a different reference. And so I'm saying when it comes to the Trinity, there are going to be certain thoughts or beliefs even that they have that are self-referential, which cannot be shared across. Now, that's not the case for me, right? Because when I say that, well, I had this thought last week, or I will have a thought in, I don't know, 20 minutes, or what I'm thinking now, that I still has the same reference point. And so there still seems to be some type of disanalogy between the different aspects of my consciousness and how it can be expressed in language versus the different aspects of consciousness within the Trinity, and the fact that it would be impossible for them to share certain thoughts and express them the same way. Do you see what I'm trying to explain, at least?
Yeah. So how would you define omniscience then?
For God, obviously, I would say that he knows all true propositions and he doesn't know any false ones.
Right, and that's exactly how I would define omniscience. So
Yeah, so
I
I'm
would
not
say
saying
that.
that, I'm not, to be clear, I wasn't saying that this would mean that if the son doesn't know that he's the father, that he wouldn't be omniscient. I'm not saying that, because that would be contradictory. He wouldn't know a false proposition. But what I'm saying is, because that would be a false proposition for him to know, that shows a disanalogy between my thoughts and my different modes of consciousness and experience, because that would never be true. Anything that is really truly predicated of my consciousness, I would be able to affirm whether I knew it or not, right? So
Right.
that's what I meant. I wasn't saying that would make the son or the father lacking knowledge that they should have, or anything like that.
Okay, well, yeah,
Is
thanks for
that
the
clear?
clarification. Yeah,
Yeah.
and like since we're talking about it in a social Trinitarian model, again, you would have this one center of consciousness who could affirm that I am the Son, one could affirm I am the Father. I don't see that as a problem for them, not for that having a sort of problem for the Trinity in any way. They just have different statements they know about themselves, which they can also all know of each other.
Yeah. Now, as an idealist, and your understanding of persons in this context, would you say that a center of self-consciousness is a substance?
Uh, See, that's a difficult thing. I would say ultimately yes, because as an idealist, we affirm all reduces to mind. So consciousness is fundamental.
Hmm. Okay, and then I guess what I'm saying here is, if we have three centers of self-consciousness, with three distinct wills, in the sense that they're not identical. Now, they might always agree, which is another concern. But let's just say, for sake of argument, you have three wills that always agree with one another, and three centers of self-consciousness. Given that a self-conscious agent is a substance, it would seem to follow that you would have three substances within a trinity.
So yeah, that's a objection I was just thinking of, and now go back to my analogy of Moon Knight. We wouldn't say Moon Knight is a different substance when he's talking about the different persons that are part of his being. He is still one being, even though he has three centers of consciousness or three persons within him. He would not, they cannot separate themselves out and be different substances. They're all part of the same being in that sense. So, and also, I mean, when we're talking about consciousness itself, I mean, there are models in idealism like Bernardo Kastrup's that argues that all of us are of the same substance. He argues, mine's a little bit different, but he argues specifically that we are all consciousness of the universe, and we have these dissociative identity disorder issue. So he argues that no, everyone is ultimately connected somehow, even though we are experiencing distinction. But likewise, you could argue something sort of similar for the Trinity on his model. There is just there are three centers of consciousness, even though they're all same of the one being.
Right. So okay. So this is good because this is the touching on the point that I'm seeing the difference between, right? So
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to sorry, what was the name of the character in the movie you mentioned? I keep forgetting.
It's a Moon Knight, so it's a Marvel show. It's
Okay.
on Disney
Okay,
right
Moon Knight.
now.
Okay,
Yeah.
so with Moon Knight, right? With Moon Knight, and I think it's important to notice when you describe Moon Knight, you're expressing it in a way that you're talking about different parts of Moon Knight, and that's why initially I understood it that way. Now I get that because I think that there are different quote unquote mental parts of me in the sense that they're not identical and I can make distinctions between them, et cetera, et cetera. However, um, I think what the difference is in what you said, that I have at least potentially access to those different aspects of Jake or those different aspects of Moon Knight or parts or whatever you want to say.
Mm-hmm.
However, what I was kind of pressing on before, that doesn't seem to be the case with the Trinity, right? And now you're bringing up Castro's theory. Now, I'm wondering if you would apply it in the same way. Is it that the persons of the Trinity do have potential access to each other's consciousness to experience it in the same way, or do they not? Because on a social Trinitarian perspective, it seems like you would want to say that they don't. And that's what gives you the sort of robust understanding of persons to be able to distinguish them from one another. But if the Father can experience the same thought or proposition that I am the Son in the same way that the Son can, well, then it seems to really start collapsing back into some type of modalism. And now the persons aren't really as distinct as we tried to set out to with the social Trinitarian model, right? So this is my
No,
concern is which way we're going to go.
no, and I don't think that necessarily would follow because you have three centers of consciousness that would be distinct, two proceeding from the Father, of course. So, no, I don't think that necessarily is a problem because when you create a distinct center of consciousness, so just take Kastrup's model. Like, let's say he's right and that the consciousness is fundamental and we are all emergent features of that consciousness, and that we are all just experiencing some sort of distinction right now in terms of our human experience. You could not have the thought I have that I am Michael, and I could not have your thought that I am Jake, even though on his model we would still somehow be that's connected to that same kind of consciousness. We would all still be connected through the fact that the underlying world is conscious itself, even though we can experience these different types of distinctions. So, I mean, what we're trying to think, what I worry what you're trying to do is you're trying to think of the sort of consciousness works in terms of like a physical substance, that it's going to sort of separate these types of things. And this gets back to my issues when you get into philosophy of mind. It's very hard to sort of draw those kinds of distinctions, but we can still talk of them in distinct ways, even though we understand the lines between them are kind of blurry.
Right. So you brought up the Father generating the Son, the Spirit. I do want to address that at some point, but I don't want to get to it this soon. But my question is going to be, like, the way you're describing Kashrup's theory, right, and his understanding that you have like this one mind, and then it's almost like generating these other consciousnesses, and as you said, it's like this dissociative identity type of thing. Is it the same with the Trinity? This is what I'm asking, because is it like the Father serves as that one mental substance, and then the Son, the Spirit are, I don't know, somehow being generated by him in that way? Is that the way that you're envisioning it?
So I'm not entirely sure what you mean. Can you clarify a little bit more on that? Because
Okay,
I'm trying to think in terms of a mental space, and it's
yeah.
If that makes any sense.
Well, I guess in the same way that you were describing Kashrup's idealism, is it similar that it would just map onto God? Because I would think that you want to say there's some difference between God and creation. You would hold to that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we can start there. What do you think the difference is between God and creation?
So I would say that the following Eastern view, I would say that it sort of proceeds from the God's energies,
Hmm.
because I do hold to some weak form of panentheism. So there is
Hmm.
some sort of connection, but we don't share the essence of God.
Okay, and then okay, so we don't share the essence of God, but we would be. Would you think that we're kind of just energies of God in that sense?
Perhaps, yeah, I could see that. Yeah, because I do the way I sort of explain it is like God sort of creates a mental world that is proceeding from his energies and not directly from his essence.
Okay. And then when it comes to the divine processions of the Son and the Spirit, being generated and proceeding from the Father, what would the relevant difference between that and creation be?
So the difference is the Son and the Spirit share in the divine essence of God. So they share all the same intrinsic properties. So omniscience, omnipotence, they're part of the same essence. So if we compare it again to again analogous to like Moon Knight, I mean when Mark, who is the originator, generates Stephen and Jake, they have the same power. They can activate the Moon Knight. They can control the body that they live in, I guess you could say, and they can have all the same powers that he has. They share in the same essence of Mark, who is the originator of them. They're not somehow like lesser, and he can block them out. In fact, in the show, there's that back and forth between them at times.
Hmm. Now, you're saying that okay, the difference is that they share the same essence, and even though they're generated. Now, you mentioned that they have the same powers and intrinsic properties. The question I have is, do the Son and the Spirit have the same intrinsic property that the Father has, which is to cause or to produce another divine person?
So are you talking about Aseity right now?
No, no, no. I'm saying in terms of the Father. The Father is the cause of the Son and the Spirit. I don't know where you
Right.
stand on the filioque. Do you think that the Father
Yeah.
alone causes this Spirit, or is the Son involved in that
So I'm
causation?
still sort of undecided on that whole issue. I don't think it's really important for my model per se, or my understanding of the Trinity. Uh, I would be okay with affirming either way. It's not been a real issue for me as of now. Like it's just been one of those
Okay,
things.
yeah, yeah. My concern is this: that when you say that the Father, Son, and Spirit have the same intrinsic properties, well, the Father has an intrinsic property which is the ability or potential to beget and spirate uh,
Hmm.
another divine person. Now, under the Orthodox model that rejects the understanding of the Western Church and the Filioque, they say that the Father alone has the ability to produce another divine person, and therefore the Son is not actively involved in the causation of the Holy Spirit. Now,
Hmm.
I think that causes problems for what you said, because if that is the case, then they don't have all the same intrinsic properties. The Father alone has a unique property to produce or cause another divine person, and the Son and the Spirit don't. That's why I'm asking.
So we're talking about causes. I mean, the issue then becomes, are we talking about intrinsic or extrinsic properties? Because when we talk about causality, it seems like we're talking about extrinsic properties because then we're talking about its relation to other things. When you talk about an extrinsic property, you're talking about how it relates to another thing. So there are two ways to go on this. If you're going to take it, you could say the Son and the Spirit have that same ability. They just don't. Uh, uh, they don't see it necessary to employ it, or they don't. Another issue could be simply be that it's just an extrinsic property of the Father. It's not necessarily an essential intrinsic property. It would just be an essential extrinsic property, if that makes sense.
Um, so, well, if it's an action that the Father performs, um,
Hmm.
it's not that I'm just merely talking about the action. I'm talking about the ability to perform the action, and the ability
Okay.
to perform the action seems to be intrinsic. It's not. It's
So
not. It's not dependent upon anything other than itself. It's an intrinsic part of the nature, the way that something is, and it's propensity to cause things in a particular
I
way.
see. Yeah, I don't see any issue with the Son and the Spirit having that ability. It's just there's a difference between, I guess the Philoquate controversy is more about where the Spirit is generated from. It's not so much an ability, but the actual process itself.
Yeah. So let me explain to well, let me give you my understanding from the Eastern side of one of the potential worries. And actually, on this channel tomorrow, I will be having a debate. Well, it's a formal debate with Dr. Branson, who holds the Eastern view, and he would make this criticism. So I'm going to represent him, and he can tell me tomorrow if I did it properly or not. But
Mhm.
insofar as I understand the criticism correctly, what he would say is that if the Son and the Spirit also share that intrinsic property of being able to beget a another divine person, then his concern is that you would wind up with an infinite regress of persons, because then the Son would have that ability and he would act on it. So would the Holy Spirit, and so would the fourth person. And there's no arbitrary way to stopping that process. In other words, why would three be the lucky number instead of four or an infinite amount? If they each have that ability, why would it be that only the Father alone chooses to exercise that? And why does he alone choose to cause only two divine persons, a Son and a Spirit, rather than a fourth one, even on his own? So this is kind of the concern. It has the potential to wind up in infinite regress.
So my whole issue with this is that there's a difference between like a possibility and a state of something. You could say that that is a possibility, but you could not say that God actually did such a thing. For example, we could say God has the power right now to destroy all life, all time in and of itself, but he doesn't act upon that. Just because you could say there's an ability there to produce more persons, I don't think it follows that God necessarily does or has. And the reason may be beyond our understanding, or be, with part of the whole issue of God's division with us. He may have certain uh, states, knowledge that are beyond our understanding, that are just beyond our comprehension. It's not really important to understanding the Trinity of itself and how it could function within a mental substance. It's just simply a possibility that could happen, but I don't necessarily see that as a problem because it's not an actual state of things.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was muted. So, no, the only reason I brought it up is just because you made that comment about having the same intrinsic properties. So I'm just saying
Mhm.
that's a potential worry. Whether or not this thing is a legitimate concern about the infinite regress, I'm just saying if they to say that they have the same intrinsic properties, I think, and this is going to be part of my argument actually tomorrow with Bo, is that in order to make that statement, they would need to have the same causal powers, even if they didn't act on them. I'm not saying that the
Mhm.
action has to be the same, but the abilities or the causal powers presumably would have to be the same in order to say that they have the same intrinsic properties, right? So
Right. And I
anyway,
would be
that
okay
was just, it
affirming.
wasn't like the main, it wasn't, yeah, just one last thing. It wasn't the main crux of your model of the Trinity, right?
Mhm.
You just made that kind of off the cuff remark. So that's why I was just
Okay.
offering
Yeah, I
some
mean, I'm
response
okay
to it.
affirming with all sorts of abilities that God could have. It's just there's a difference between acting on it. Like you could say
Yeah.
that it's possible that the Son could disagree with the Father. I guess you could say, but they're not going to because of perfect goodness. You could say that perhaps because of their perfect goodness, their perfect omniscience, it just is logically incoherent for them to generate more than three persons. Now, again, we may not know why that is the case, but that does not. I don't think that creates any sort of logical issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could potentially, it potentially can, given what I said about how you stop the process, and why is it that the Son does not act upon it? Because one of Dr. Branson's his arguments is he uses a modal ontological argument for the Son,
Mhm.
and what he basically says is that obviously my concern is aseity. If the Son is God and he lacks aseity, then he can't be God, which I'm sure you're familiar with the criticism. And he says,
Right.
no, well, all we have is we have the divine essence or the divine nature, and then we just have it lacking aseity. There's really no difference. So what he's basically arguing is if the existence of the Son is possible, then he's necessary, because anything that's possibly necessary is necessary itself based on S5. And so what he's going to say is, if you think that the existence of the Son, meaning having the divine nature and yet lacking aseity, is possible and it's possibly necessary, then it's going to be necessary, and therefore you need the Son. Same thing with the Holy Spirit. Now, if that was true, then you would be able to duplicate that same process an infinite amount of times and have an infinite duplicate of persons. His way of solving that problem is saying, no, only the Father has the ability to produce a divine person. He produces these two divine persons, and then that stops the process. It doesn't continue because the Son and the Spirit don't have that ability. So, I mean, it's not central to what we were talking about earlier, but it is something to consider. I mean,
it's something to consider. I think my pushback for now would be, unless he could convince me otherwise, would be like there's a difference between God acting and God's abilities. I don't think that just because the Son and the Spirit share in the same essence, they're going to do everything that they could potentially do. And I think that would be because they would share in the essence of God, perfect goodness, omniscience, and they would therefore know and act in accordance with that. It's like saying, can a omnipotent being create a stone so heavy even he can't lift? Or can a morally perfect being do something that's evil, like, torture or rape or something? We would say no, because that's just a logical contradiction. So you could say the different attributes of God sort of prevent that spiraling effect you were talking about.
Yeah, that's fine. I think we should move on from this point and try to get back to the main crux of it. So, or maybe dealing with slightly on a different notion, but so the Nicene Creed, which you seem to be affirming, and the fact that the Son is generated, obviously it brings up the issue which you mentioned, Dr. Sijuwade. I've had 2 discussions with him on this, and obviously we disagree. That's fine, but I would hold that aseity is necessary in order to be God. Would you just deny that, and if so, why?
Well, I would agree with Sijuwade on this, and I think his criticisms are work. Aseity seems to be more like a neutral property. You can think of, again, the example of Moon Knight. When Mark is the originator, he's the first of the persons. When he generates Stephen and Jake, they have the full power of Moon Knight. The fact that they are just generated, or they're not the originator, doesn't make them more powerful or less powerful. It makes them all equal. So they're all sharing in the same essence. So when the Father generates the Spirit and the Son, they all share in the same essence. They share all the same intrinsic properties, as Sijuwade notes.
Okay, so my question is, in that case, then they share the same essence, but they don't all have aseity. So that would mean that the divine nature or essence does not entail aseity. Would you agree with that?
I would say when it comes to the Father, it's an essential extrinsic property, but for the Son, it is not. It's like saying, does my broad sense of agency have free will? Well, I mean, that's hard to really say. I would say that in the narrow sense, that seems to be a quality of my narrow sense of agency, to have free will. But could we really say the broad sense also has free will? Does it actually consciously deliberate? Do we consciously deliberate in that way? Well, no, conscious deliberation is an ability or a feature of our narrow sense of agency. So the question then becomes, is just because there is some aspect central to the Father, that does not mean it necessarily has to be central aspect to the rest of the whole being itself.
Yeah. I guess what I'm saying is that possession of the divine nature or essence does not entail or necessitate aseity. Aseity in this case would be a personal property or hypostatic property of the Father alone, and it's not a property of the divine essence. And so if it doesn't entail it and it's a personal property of the Father, then the concern would be, we can have another essence that is not the divine essence, that is ase. And how would you respond to that?
What do you mean another essence? So you say that again,
Because
another
we could,
essence?
I could posit an example of, for example, since there's nothing really special about the divine essence that guarantees or necessitates aseity, I can have potentially a rock that is ase, that has a different nature. It doesn't have the divine nature, and it's just an ase rock.
So separate from God, then, is what you're saying. That's an Ase rock.
Yeah, there would be a possible world in which a rock is ase existing, and there's no immediate contradiction with that, given the fact that there's nothing special about the divine nature that entails or necessitates its aseity.
So I think one thing we need to note is, again, it's a question of it's a great making property. And again, I think Sijuwati makes a pretty good case that it doesn't really add anything to the being in and of itself when you think of it. Now, I'm kind of confused by your comment here, because you're saying that are you saying on your view or your worldview, it would be logically impossible for there to be a possible world with a rock that's ase? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying an ase rock is impossible. Yeah.
An ase rock is impossible. Why?
Yeah. So you don't believe that?
Well, I'm asking, like, why would you say?
Well, because this is what I'm saying. Because Sijuwate's position leads to possible worlds in which you have ase rocks and ase cows and all this kind of thing. And my point of bringing that up is to say, if there's nothing special, so to speak, about the divine nature that guarantees its aseity, then we have all these other possible worlds in which we have these ase beings with different natures. And that just doesn't seem to be correct. I mean,
so
how do you square that?
How are you defining something logical? Because it sounds entirely logical in what you're describing. It doesn't sound like something like 2 + 2 = 5. Like
No. I'm not saying it's logically impossible. I'm saying it's metaphysically impossible. Given the nature of what it means to be divine and God, and what it means to be a rock. But I'm saying the model you're proposing, or Sijuwate's, which, by the way, I've brought this up to him and he simply bites the bullet, because he doesn't believe God is a metaphysically necessary being. He believes he's contingent. And what I'm trying to say is the offshoot of this position is just that God is contingent, because of the fact that there's nothing special about the divine nature that guarantees aseity or necessity or anything else. We can have a ase cow or an ase rock that is not dependent upon anything else and is necessary itself. So that's the concern.
Yeah, and I as I said, I would agree with Sijuwati on that. I don't think it necessarily follows that those things would be logically incoherent. It's very hard for me to say that something is going to be logically incoherent, like a married bachelor, because
But would you say it's metaphysically possible?
Which is given metaphysically impossible.
No, I'm saying, would you say it's metaphysically possible? I agree with you. It's not just something that is like a square circle. That's not what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'm saying, do you think that those are legitimately metaphysically possible, meaning that in some possible world an ase rock exists?
Well, as long as we know what we define by metaphysically possible worlds, I would agree, yes. And I tend to take them as like mereological constructs. So yeah, they are entirely logically possible in metaphysical sense. I don't see, and that's not because of any Trinitarian theology. That's just because I don't see any logical contradictions from there, unless we presuppose there's something special about Aseity in itself. And Aseity itself does not appear to be a great making property on the surface.
Yeah, but this is what I'm saying. When you're analyzing these properties, what I'm trying to say is we have to have metaphysical considerations involved. That's what the idea is. It's like when we're discussing whether or not an ase rock is possible, well, if we already have these considerations that it couldn't be because of the nature of what it means to be a rock or what it means to be a cow. If you just look at it in a vacuum, just from a purely like epistemic modality, and it's due to your ignorance, then that's one thing. But when you understand the nature of what it means to be a rock or a cow or anything else, well, then, yeah, it just seems not to be metaphysically possible. Now, what I'm saying is, if you're saying that it is metaphysically possible, then my question is, why is it that God happens to be Ase in the actual world rather than a rock? It just seems to be dumb luck, because there's nothing about the nature of God or the nature of the rock that is determining or entailing that in any way. That's the concern.
So again, we cannot presuppose Aseity is necessarily a great making property. So I don't see that as really a problem. It's like when I talk to like a pantheist, for example, they'll say that, well, my version of God is greater because it encompasses all things. Encompassing all things is a great making property. Therefore, my God is greater. And I would say, well, I've seen Christians argue, well, no, my God, or Muslims as well have argued this, that my God can cause things separate from him that makes him greater. The question, of course, when it comes to Aseity is can we show this somehow adds anything in terms of great making properties to a being? And as far as I'm aware, and agreeing with Sijawati here, I don't see that necessarily it follows. So I don't see that as being a problem when it's being brought up in this sense.
Yeah, I think it's a problem for God's necessity, because if those are legitimately metaphysically possible worlds, then God would not exist in every possible world, in which case he wouldn't be metaphysically necessary. That's the concern.
I mean, the question, of course, is Aseity help necessary existence? And how would you define necessary existence?
Yeah, so, okay, let me try to explain what I'm saying. When Sijawati, I don't know if you've seen, not on this channel, but on my channel, he had a discussion with another Christian, Ryan Mullins. I don't know if you've seen that discussion. And he goes through basically criteria for what it means to be an intrinsic property. Now, in that, he explains that in order to be an intrinsic property, the property must be had or lacked, whether it is lonely or accompanied. Meaning, if it's a lonely object, it must be able to have or lack the property. And if it's accompanied, it must be able to have or lack the property. And he says that Aseity doesn't fit the bill because a lonely object does not have the ability to lack Aseity, because it would necessarily be Ase because there's nothing else for it to depend on. Now, I'm saying in that scenario, is that being used as merely a epistemic or heuristic device, or is that going to really have metaphysical import? Are those real metaphysical possibilities in which an Ase rock can exist? If you say yes, that it is, then that means that God doesn't exist in every possible world and he wouldn't be necessary. If you say that it doesn't, then, and it's merely a heuristic device, then I fail to understand why I need to take it seriously in its understanding of the nature of natures and properties, when it's just like not even really having metaphysical import anyway.
Well, yeah, I mean, Sijawati follows Swinburne in this whole contingency thing, correct?
Yeah, and I'm just wondering if you do as well. If you do, that's fine. I mean, but I'm just trying to understand your view.
So that's something I've currently been undecided on for the past year. Because I used to reject Swinburne's view, and over the past year or so, I've sort of been moving more in that direction.
Okay, yeah,
when it comes to
that
the whole,
clears things up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see it necessarily as a whole logical issue for the Trinity. It would just, it might make some redefinitional issues all the same. But I mean, following Swinburne and Sijawati, I wouldn't see that necessarily as a whole issue. I do ever think there might be some replies to there in terms of Aseity, just in how it turns of understanding. And if you could just, and possibly understanding necessity in sort of a different way. But then again, that seems like it's a whole rabbit trail in of itself.
Yeah. That's fine. The only reason I'm really kind of pressing on these issues is to understand precisely your view, because as I spoke to you before and you agreed, on your channel, you haven't gone into too many of these things in depth. So,
no,
you know,
I'm planning on getting back to it. It's just I've been really busy with other topics. But
I mean, you
my views
recently got your master's anyway, right? So you've been busy studying other stuff.
Yeah,
I imagine.
And my views have definitely evolved since I've done a lot of those older videos. But yeah, I don't see that necessarily as a huge issue when it comes to formulating a logical, coherent understanding of the Trinity.
Okay, that's fine. All right. So, Michael, we're an hour and 5 minutes now. We said that 90 minutes would be the deadline. what I want to do is try to just get back to, in this last 10 minutes or so, the fundamentals of your position, because I've been doing a lot of questioning, but I want to give you a chance to try to tie everything together and explain and allow people to understand your view a bit better.
Yeah.
So go ahead. Yeah.
So just to think about things, I think a lot of the objections to the Trinity tend to not really be that it's logically incoherent, that it seems to be incomprehensible. And to give an analogy, Stephen Barr in his book, Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, at one point talks about how it's entirely mathematically consistent that there are possible universes that not only have multiple dimensions of space, but multiple dimensions of time. Now, I can't even begin to fathom what it'd be like to live in a universe where there are 2 dimensions of time, let alone 3 or 4. But Stephen Barr, who's a physicist, says that they're entirely logically possible, entirely consistent with the mathematics. When it comes to the Trinity, I think when we start understanding the Trinity in terms of philosophy of mind, it can be formulated quite easily in a logically consistent way. You just simply picture one being that could be defined in terms of that could be analogous to our broad sense of agency. And there are 3 narrow senses of agency within the broad sense of agency. We have our understanding of our own agency tend to have a kind of a fluid understanding of it. You might think of yourself as a conscious mind inside of a larger sense of being, but sometimes you might think of yourself in a more broad sense. You might connect yourself to certain desires. You might separate yourself from those desires. You might connect yourself to certain memories, certain dispositions. You may choose to activate your free will to go against certain desires. Sometimes you may allow those desires to overcome you. So our own sense of agency does not seem to be understood in the same sort of physical way we understand like a physical thing. So again, my essential idea is that we need to start understanding the Trinity in terms of mental substances. And when we do that, I don't see there as any sort of logical incoherence in terms of formulating a model, because we start understanding the different senses of agency. It can clear up things like with difference. It can clear up issues like, well, how is the Trinity divine versus how is the persons are divine? In a mental reality, those don't seem to be real issues.
Mm-hmm. Now, Michael, if you've surveyed some of the literature on the different models, is there any Christian scholar or philosopher that you've read that you've taken inspiration from at all for formulating your model that we could point people to reading, or are you is your view just totally novel in that way?
Well, I mean, my it's not so much a different model. I hold to the monarchical view of the Trinity that Sijuwati puts out there, as well as some of what Richard Swinburne puts out there. It's just a different way of it's like a different avenue of understanding the Trinity. We need to stop explaining it in terms of like physical substances. It needs to be compared to like a mental agent. So it's not so much as a different model. It's just a different avenue of understanding the Trinity. It must be understood through mental parameters and through philosophy of mind, not through comparing it to like different humans that may have the same nature, or a cat and a skeleton, or a 3-leaf clover, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So it's just taking this specific aspect of philosophy of mind and applying it to a model that already exists as far as you're concerned. Now, do you know of anybody that's done that yet? I'm just asking because I would like to read on it. That's all.
No, I have not. This is something I've been thinking about because I took a lot of classes on philosophy of agency and philosophy of mind. And from just hearing the whole different views on understanding of human agency in and of itself, it got me thinking more about the Trinity. So as I told you on the onset, this is just me starting to think about these things in more broader terms, something more to explore. I don't know of any theologians that have done this type of thing, but I'd be interested to find some of that. It's just something I have sort of picked up from studying philosophy of agency itself.
Right. Now, as far as your overall position, how do you see it from a historical position, like from a historical perspective? How do you see it situated in the tradition?
Okay, so I don't really see it as any sort of problem. I think it could actually be compatible with multiple models of the Trinity. Again, it's just a different avenue of sort of explaining it. Like, let's start applying the language we see in philosophy of mind to Trinitarian theology, because God ultimately is a mind. we need to start using that when we're talking about God. So it's not really a different model or anything like that. It's just trying to say, hey, when we're doing theology, draw from philosophy of mind. That's going to help. It's the same sort of principles I was getting from J.P. Moreland in this talk that I attended.
Right. The reason I ask, because as far as and I'm happy to be corrected, but as far as my survey of the literature, at least early in the Christian tradition, when you look at 4th, 5th century writers and onwards, it seems to be, at the very least, I'll make the claim that the more dominant view is that there's only one will in the Trinity rather than three wills. And this sort of three will view that has been proposed by social Trinitarians seems to be something that has developed much later on. Given sort of Cartesian understandings of what persons are and modern psychology and these sorts of things of what you're talking about, philosophy of mind. I don't know if you've read into that at all and you just disagree with my historical analysis, or maybe you agree, but you're just not bothered by it. What would your
I'm not really bothered by that. I mean, when Galileo was on trial, not for practicing science, but for assaulting the Pope and doing a bunch of other stupid things that he did, his own responders said that if Galileo turned out to be right about this model he presented, it would just mean that we need to develop our understanding of Scripture in light of the 67th book of nature, or the 67th book of Scripture, which they called nature. Some of the church fathers referred to as that. So I don't see that as necessarily as a big problem for me. It's just we progress in our understanding of what these terms mean. And I think applying philosophy of mind can sort of help with that.
Right. Yeah, the last comment I guess I'll make on that is that just to give a historical background of what I'm thinking about is that there's a question over whether or not
I also have a question for you too, if we got time.
Yeah, sure. This will be the last thing that I'll say. So whether or not will is a property of natures or persons, right? And under your model, it seems that will is a property of the persons because we have three persons, we have three wills. Whereas the historical position seems that will is a property of nature. And the reason how we see this is when it comes to Christ in the incarnate state, there was a controversy of dialetheism versus monotheism, which is basically whether or not Christ had one or two wills in the incarnate state. And what eventually won out in terms of what was declared at the council in 681 at Constantinople was that Christ had two wills. And the reason they said that was that will is a property of the nature. Christ had two natures, therefore he had two wills. And so that's why I'm saying it would seem to conflict with that. And that's why many people like Richard Swinburne, who take the three will position in order to remain consistent, he just says, well, yeah, in the incarnate state, Christ only had one will because will is a property of person, not of natures. So that's another thing that I'm saying it could have effect on your Christology as well. And I just didn't know if you considered that at all.
No, I mean, for example, I'm not a substance dualist like Swinburne. I actually take an Aristotelian version of the soul, so more of an abstractionist type on that. So that actually, I think, is even less of a problem for me than it would be for him.
Okay. All right. So if you want to go ahead and ask me your question, or
no, I wanted to get back to necessary existence because I was confused on how you were defining that and how it relates to aseity.
Okay. So what I was saying about necessary existence, if we're talking about impossible worlds, a necessary being is one that exists in all possible worlds. When we're using the example that Josh gives, the necessary being wouldn't exist in all possible worlds, because you have the example of an Ase rock, and he's a lonely object. There's nothing else besides him, and that's why he has the property of aseity, because there's nothing else for him to be dependent on. He's there by himself, the rock or whatever else you want to put in it. And the concern with that is, if that is a legitimate possible world, then that would then entail that God couldn't be metaphysically necessary, because that would be a world that he didn't exist in. And if what it means to be necessary is to exist in every possible, metaphysically possible world, then he wouldn't be metaphysically necessary. That was my concern and my argument.
Okay, so just to be clear on things, I want to make sure I understand your position right. So God could not exist in a world with like an Aseity rock, on your view.
Well, okay, so here's the difference. Okay, in the world in which the Aseity rock exists, does God also exist in that world, or does he not exist in that world?
Well, I'm
That's what we
asking
have to
you
be
because I'm
clear
trying to
on.
get an understanding of your view.
Well, I'm saying in the way that Sijuwade is presenting it, it's unclear. If God exists in that possible world, then now you have two Aseity beings. And the question is, that would mean there's really nothing about the nature of the rock or the nature of God which has anything to do with Aseity. So now you have an uncaused thing. Now that rock itself in that world, would it be contingent or necessary alongside God? If it's necessary alongside God, then you have two necessary beings. You have God and the rock. If it's contingent, then it's either explained by God himself and then would no longer really be Aseity, or it's not explained and then you have a brute contingency. So you're either going to wind up with multiple necessary beings or a brute contingency in that case.
But would that Aseity rock be necessary in all possible worlds?
Well, so here's the thing. If that Aseity rock, right, exists in that world, does it exist necessarily? If you're saying it exists contingently, then in what sense is it contingent? Does it have an explanation for its existence? Well, if it's Aseity, it doesn't depend on anything. So presumably its explanation is within itself, and therefore it doesn't. How would it be contingent? In what manner would it be contingent?
So I mean, I'm just trying to understand how. I guess I'm confused on how Aseity is essentially a part of the property of necessity, and I don't know if we're going to agree.
I guess
on
what
that,
I'm saying, yeah,
but again,
I guess the example I'm giving is that, to be clear, Aseity entails necessity. That's what I'm saying.
Aseity entails. Okay, so you would say that. See, I'm not entirely convinced of that, but again, I'm not really even sure because as I said, I've been drifting more towards Swinburne on this, so I'm not really sure where I am on that. But yeah, that's why I wanted to ask, because I don't think it's necessary to have a coherent model of the Trinity. But yeah, I'm just trying to figure out where if I moved all the way into Swinburne's camp, or if I'm still not there yet. But I'm still not even sure if I'm entirely convinced that Aseity is necessary or is part of.
Okay,
necessity.
let me be clear what I'm saying and what I'm not, Michael, because I don't want to confuse the audience. What I'm not saying that Aseity and necessity are identical properties or the same. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, yeah. I'm just want to be clear because I don't want people to be confused. So because it could be a bit tricky. What I'm saying is that Aseity, from my view, entails necessity. And even if you wanted to say, well, then, Jake, that wouldn't necessarily mean that anything that's necessary is also Aseity. You could hold that position. For example, Dr. Branson, who I'm going to be debating tomorrow, he holds that position. He agrees with me that Aseity entails necessity, but that doesn't mean that necessity entails Aseity. So you could still hold to that view. He holds to that view. I agree with him on the first part, and maybe we just disagree on the second part. But what I'm saying is, at the very least, Aseity entails necessity, such that if that rock exists Aseity, then it would be necessary, because it doesn't need an explanation for it outside of itself. So that's a concern of having other things, other possible worlds where there are things that are Aseity besides God.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with that, and I think it might be because I think we're defining necessity different. But again, it's something I still need to explore more. But again, it's just another side issue entirely from the whole conversation. Yeah,
that's fine. We're at an hour 20.
Oh yeah, I got to get going soon.
Yeah, so we better wrap it up here. Abdul Rahman, you've been quiet the whole time. You've been the one that's been in contact with Michael. I don't know if you want to say anything.
Yeah, I'm just enjoying the conversation, enjoying the company. So yeah, I think it's been going well. I think it's been a great discussion. So you guys, maybe you could just conclude. I don't know if you want to take questions. There probably is
No,
no time for that.
Michael's not going to have time for questions.
I got
Yeah.
like 5
Okay.
minutes if you wanted to do something like that.
Okay, yeah. So maybe just, I guess you guys could just wrap it up.
Yeah, I guess, Michael, you could just comment on what your experience was and what you got out of the conversation, I guess.
No, I think it was a great conversation. Yeah. I would like to explore it more in philosophy of mind per se. I don't see a lot of issues when it comes to there. Again, it goes back to my main point. I think a lot of the objections to the Trinity are using physical parameters, and I see that as a problem. So it's something more I want to explore, and that's why I appreciate the conversation, to see if applying the Trinity to applying philosophy of mind to more Trinitarian theology could be helpful in making more cogent explanations. So so that's the reason why I wanted to have the conversation. I very much appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it myself. I think that it was great for not only our audience, but potentially your audience can take a look at it to see some of the developments in your own thought and how you're thinking about things further when it comes to the Trinity. It is something interesting. And I just want to plug for tomorrow and something that you might be interested in, Michael. I will be having a debate tomorrow with Dr. Bo Branson on this same channel at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's going to be a little bit different than this because it's going to be a formatted debate. It's not just going to be a free, open discussion like this one was. But Bo and I have spoken several times before. I respect him, even though I disagree with him, and I think he's highly intelligent. He's someone who is going to attempt to defend not exactly the same view that you are, but on the issue of aseity. He doesn't believe that aseity is necessary in order to be divine. So you may get some use out of that in terms of what he has to say and my potential concerns, and people can take a look at it and determine for themselves what they think of that discussion.
Yeah,
But,
that's something I'm undecided on still. I still need to figure out where I land on there.
Yeah, sure. All right, guys. So, I mean, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, Michael. Maybe we can do it again sometime in the future. But I appreciate everybody watching. Make sure you consider subscribing to the channel and checking us out tomorrow, God willing, at 4 p.m. But until next time, guys, inshallah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. حي على